Well, hey, welcome back to the X Podcast. I am here, co-host Tim, and special guest, Miss Janice.
Hey, good
How are you guys
to be here.
doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really glad to be here.
It's exciting. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Doing wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing really well.
Okay.
All right.
You look great today. I just want to
thank
point that
you.
out.
Oh, thank you so much.
You look excellent.
What Tim is referencing is
What?
I am pretty under the weather. But you know what? We have
You're
made
here.
a commitment
That's right.
to our listeners and viewers and everybody on Sunday, because if you are just tuning in or if you're just tuning in for the first time in a while, we are in the middle of a really important moment, both in our church and in our podcast, where we are pairing our podcast with a message series on Sunday called It's Complicated, where we're diving into abortion, racism, sexuality, gender, culture wars, and politics.
Yeah.
And can I just say, it has been overwhelming so far in a good way. The response,
So good.
the conversations that it's spurred on, the healing moments even that it's spurred on.
Hey, I
Go
just
ahead.
want to give a shout out. My wife has actually listened to both podcasts so far,
No
all the way
way.
through. She said, "I'm going to listen to these." She doesn't listen to any of the other ones, which is good because I can say whatever I want. But she said, "I'm going to listen to
She
these."
listens to the Inspired
Yeah, she does.
podcast.
I that was on the other day.
Yes.
Lorelei,
But
if
she's
you're
actually
listening-
listened. She will. She listened to both of them, all 2 hours of the last one.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
Lorelei, if
Proud
you're
of her.
listening, don't go back to episode 13 where Tim dives into what he considers your cleaning habit errors.
He's making that up.
Yes, I am. But that is when you know it's special. When you know, your
When Lorelai's
spouse is
watching,
joining
that's
in. So
amazing.
that's awesome.
Yep.
And this past week, we hit maybe not for everybody, but I think maybe overall one of the most sensitive topics, depending on the people in the room, and that is abortion. And I think you did, not just saying this, I think everybody felt like you just did an incredible job. You really tried to disarm and acknowledge the different kind of people coming in the room, because when you were talking about abortion, you got extremes on every side. You got a lot of people, especially maybe church people, that this is their passionate hot button issue. This is what they, if they're going to post about anything or vote about anything, it's going to be this.
Yeah.
And maybe even secretly have been like, okay, I'm glad we're finally addressing it. And are really passionate about it. And then you have other people that are very passionate about it from the other side. And maybe from just a different background, are like, okay, when you look at abortion or specifically Roe v. Wade, this brings terror to me. This brings fear to me, because this is all about women's rights, and this is all about oppression for women. And then you have people maybe somewhere in the middle that for them it's not just a spiritual issue or a political issue, it's a deeply personal issue. That this isn't just a concept to address. This is a very personal, visceral thing they feel anytime it's brought up, because they've actually walked through it. And so, but then from there, you really built a framework, and we won't go in detail here. We've said this. We don't usually do this on the podcast, but shameless plug, go back and watch it if you haven't watched it.
Yeah, you
But
do. It's
you
so
built a
good.
framework for personhood theory, which really is a foundational concept and a worldview that's going to set us up for future weeks when we talk about gender and sexuality. And then, you walked us through how, if putting politics aside, biblically, we really do see God as the author of life.
Yeah.
That God is for life because he created life. And then just a beautiful moment at the end to acknowledge, I think the stat was 4 out of 10 women in church have walked through abortion.
Well, I don't know if it's 4 out of 10 women in church. The stat would be that of the women that were surveyed, 4 out of 10 said they go to church. There's a difference between saying 40% of women in church versus those who had the abortion. 40% of them said they go to church. That number might not be 40% of women in church. I guess I just wanted to... If that makes sense.
That's
A little bit of a difference, but it can make a huge
Mm-hmm.
difference in percentage. But still, a startling... See, I had that in front of me as I was thinking through the entire conversation. To know that there are whatever percentages, some say 25% of women in church, some probably higher than that, I would think higher, but have had an abortion and have dealt with it, whether it was, just elective out of convenience or it was any one of the numerous circumstantial things that I just briefly mentioned on Sunday. Besides that, the weight of that, one study that I showed, the amount of women that feel guilt and sadness and loss, and were uncertain at the time. I think it just mixes into a highly emotional thing for a lot of women that have made those decisions, and I'd say some couples. Even the one story that I shared was from a lady who was married, and so that might be a decision that couples made as well.
Yeah, so it was powerful. Multiple, even just people that would be, what do you call them in our context, top-level volunteers pulling pastors aside and just having moments of confession, of healing.
Yeah.
It was really, really powerful. And, one of the reasons we want to miss Janice on this podcast, well, for a few reasons. One, Miss Janice is awesome. And number two, shameless plug, she is on another podcast.
That's right.
Yeah.
Shout out to the Inspired podcast,
Yeah,
our women's podcast from this church, which is incredible. Also, me and you are two white guys, which is not bad or good, but we can't always change our we can't always adjust every context.
What were you going to say?
Like we want to.
Wow. Were you just going to say we can't? Never mind.
Okay,
we'll move on. We'll
I
save
don't
that
know
for
where
another
you were
week.
going.
Oh, we'll save that for a different week.
Okay. But anyways, this is not just a deeply biblical or political or even personal issue. It is a very gendered issue. And so we did think it would be important to have a woman's voice on here to lend to this conversation. And because you have your own story in walking through this. And so I want to dive into that before we hit all, we got a lot of questions in, but two things really quickly. Number one, I want to say thank you again to everybody that's been writing in, especially these last 2 weeks. We've gotten so many questions, so many emails, and hopefully you feel like we have at least tried to hit your emails, if not directly. It's pretty fun. There's several people that I even have some back and forth emails with right now, just talking through life and different opinions, and I love that. I love that. One of the many things that hopefully can come out of this series is we can embody what it looks like to disagree agreeably. That even when we see the world differently, we can do it with civility and respect. And the goal for all of us is to love each other, honor God if we're followers of Jesus. But then also, I did this at the end of last episode, but I want to do this at the beginning. This is one of the topics that we actually have 2 previous episodes where we tackled it. And so, depending on how many questions we're able to get to today, we probably won't get too deep into the weeds with Roe v. Wade, but we actually have 2 previous podcast episodes, episode 84 and episode 87. The first one, we had Miss Morgan on there, and we really, right when the Supreme Court leak happened, and then one right after the official overturning of Roe v. Wade, we have 2 podcasts where we dove into the waters of the constitutionality, the pro-life, pro-choice debate, all of it. And so we probably won't get to everything today, but if this is a topic that means a lot to you, go back to episode 84, episode 87 of the X podcast. But Janice, not to put you on the spot, but wherever you feel like starting, would you mind to walk us just through a little bit of your story?
Yeah. Well, the first part of my story is when I was 19 years old. I was in college at the time. I was a sophomore, and I had been a Christian for about 6-7 months, and I found myself pregnant, and I didn't know what to do. So I did what my school, my dorm, everything kind of pointed me to, was that if you had an issue like that, you got on the bus and you went to Planned Parenthood downtown and talked to that, get a pregnancy test and all that kind of thing, because this was before you could go to the store and get a pregnancy test and do it at home. So I did that, and of course, I heard the line that is so often, when I talk to women, I find that they're told the same thing, that this is where you are in your pregnancy. It's like a glob of cells. You're in college. You can have children again. This would interrupt your career. This would interrupt your schooling. We can help you. Now, you have to understand the timing of all this was that this was literally almost exactly 1 month before the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade.
Wow.
So at that point, the only place that you could go was Boston or Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Those
Really?
were the two places you could go and get an abortion legally. And there were clinics and all that kind of thing. And so Planned Parenthood got plane tickets and arranged everything. And the next day, or it was probably a few days later, found myself on a plane, with my boyfriend. And we flew to Washington, D.C. And that is where, I had an abortion. I was probably about 7 or 8 weeks along. Is about where it was. And I remember so much. I mean, it's been interesting as we've been working up to this, doing this podcast, that all these little details of the day have come back that I hadn't really thought of for a long time. And I remember just it feeling very torn, because more than anything in my life, what I wanted to do was to be a mom. But I felt like I had no choice.
Yeah.
And so, and this was like, all my friends were saying, well, this is what you need to do. I only had a couple that knew that I was pregnant. And so I just, I went ahead and had the abortion. We got on a plane. We flew back home. The next day, I went home for Christmas break.
Wow.
And it was awful. I mean, it was really, really awful. I knew it was like, I wish I didn't have to do this. And for years afterwards, it was, just anything to do with babies. I went on and married my boyfriend about a year later. It was just like, here's a thing is anytime I heard a vacuum cleaner, it would set it off for the longest time, because it was a suction procedure. So just that trauma response, you know. And there was no place in the church at that time to really go for healing. And so for a number of years, I just hid and told no one, because I was so ashamed from the standpoint of, I have done something so bad. Because as I started growing in my relationship with Jesus, I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I do? And I did this when I already knew you, Jesus. How could I do this? And so I hid for a long time. The shame kept me quiet. And then when I ended up having, kids of my own, it took almost a year to get pregnant. I thought God was punishing me. And then I just, I had my oldest, and it was, first off, I was so glad that God went ahead and gave me a child after what I had done. But it was a number of years before I finally realized that God could forgive me. I'm not unforgivable. It's not an unforgivable sin. Even though I was in churches, and at that time the rhetoric was, the focus was on the unborn child. And if a woman decides to have an abortion, it's just like, we just throw her away. She's a murderer. And there was so it was just like more shame. I used to want to just find a hole and crawl into in church when those subjects would come up, because I felt like there's a light on me. I've got this big A on my shirt that says, and it's like arrows and all that. And I just wanted to hide, because I felt no love and no compassion, that this was a hard decision. It was horrible. And in a way, it's like, I don't want to do this, but I don't see any other alternative. And so I have to. And so it was a number of years that went by before I was really able to finally receive forgiveness from Jesus, forgive myself. That took a lot longer, and basically ask, forgiveness of that child too. Yeah.
I think I can only imagine right now, even as people are watching or listening, that there are probably a dozen or more women that, even as you say those things, are feeling them.
Oh, I'm sure there's even more. Think of the number of years that this has been going on.
And at the end of this podcast, we talked about it. I us talking the other day in the office, I got just chills. I got emotional hearing your story of healing, and it looks different for everybody. And so I know before we end today, I want to give a moment for you to be able to share what were some of the steps you took.
Sure.
But it is crazy thinking through, Tim mentioned the other person who sent in the email of their story and the parallels
Oh, yeah.
The parallels from the coldness you felt in the procedural moments, the silent tears streaming down as people around you just acted like this was just, just grabbing pills for a headache, all the way to what, and you kind of alluded to this, but I wonder if you have, even if part of what you experienced was during the moral majority of the 80s or 90s, and what it felt like to be in a church and feel like the spotlight's on you.
Oh, definitely.
When it was mentioned and the way it was mentioned.
Oh, yeah. I mean, everything from, the physician that did the procedure, and I remember he got done, and he helped me stand up, and he looked at me, and he goes, well, he says, you're a new woman. I didn't feel new at that point.
Oh.
I felt, really damaged at that place. But,
Yeah.
and then to go on into, like you was talking about, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the church, the moral majority, all of those kinds of things, a lot of pro-abortion thing, lining up, I can't remember what it was, but I remember going downtown here in Columbus and, and making this big chain of people around the state building and all that with signs and, the whole 9 yards. But it was just so part of church. You had to be pro-life, but then there was no space for healing for anybody else because it was almost like taken for granted. If you're sitting here in church, you couldn't possibly have ever had an abortion.
Yeah.
Come on, we don't do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's not true.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Well, here's what
Thanks
I know.
for sharing.
Yeah.
Your story,
it's powerful. We'll return to it, but here's what I know. There's a ton of people listening in your shoes and a ton of people on all spectrums. And we got a lot of questions. So I'm so glad you're here, and we're just going to go for it. Is that okay with you too?
Yep.
Let's go for it.
Yeah.
And kind of like last week, there's some specific miscellaneous ones we'll get to.
Yeah.
Then there's a couple questions that about 8 or 9 different people asked just in different ways.
Yeah.
And I think the first big question is this. It is the what ifs. So if assuming, as a follower of Jesus, or maybe even not as a follower of Jesus, assuming the conclusion that elective abortions are morally wrong, what about the what ifs? And this is before we even get into the legal or political, but just let's just say on a personal level, what the what ifs, and I'll read maybe just 1 or 2 questions. Here's one that was sent in. I know no sin is worse or better than the other. Pastor Tim brought up how there are probably so many arguments going through our heads about abortion, such as rape, the mother not being able to live through the childbirth. I also thought about those who may be homeless and don't want to bring a child into this world when they can't provide for them. I guess I'm just curious, what happens then? Is it still a sin, even if the mother may not be able to survive? There's so many what ifs. Is abortion morally wrong, period? Or are there exceptions? So let's start with the first one. And it's one that, wish we had an hour to put an airbag around it, but it is the tragic moment of a girl being violated. When you're talking about rape or even incest or molestation, how is that even to be thought about and approached with abortion, the assumption of abortion being morally wrong on one hand, but then you introduce this factor of rape? How do you even go about thinking through that?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, you do it with a lot of grace.
Yeah.
I think you have to. I think one thing is we talk about these questions, these circumstantial arguments, as kind of I mentioned on Sundays. I know there's a whole lot of circumstantial arguments that people are probably thinking of. These have been part of the debate politically for a long time. And I think a couple thoughts just even before we really attempt to address them, and I think they're a lot harder to address than, I guess I want to say that the reason why we called this series It's Complicated is because it's complicated.
Yeah.
Very.
And I think sometimes we can confuse, like in a topic like this where I addressed it in showing like Scripture, the view in Scripture is pretty consistent. It's very consistent that God is the author of life. God is for life, that the unborn is a person, all that we went through. And so I think sometimes when we look at Scripture in light of these things, it seems simple, but it's not.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to point that out before we even discuss these to say, I think a what the church at times in the past has done is that we just broad stroke everything with like, well, this verse says this and this verse says this, and so that's
right.
it. And there's no room to really have conversations. And what we're talking about, again, we can put it into categories, but these are individual, unique situations. And every situation is different and unique. And I think that what we have to do is allow Scripture to show us God's heart, to show us kind of like what God values, to show us how we as followers of Christ should live our lives, what we should set as our authority, what we should set as our guide. I think sometimes there's things in Scripture you go, okay, this is an authority, it helps us understand it. There's other places where you look to it as a guide to help you. And so I think with all that in mind, I think we have to address these things kind of individually. I don't want to put them all together because I think they're different. And I think we might all see them a little bit different. We might have different feelings and perspectives on all of these, even those of us at the table, and that's okay. And I think it's just, let's just keep in mind that there's not going to be a clean, simple, neat answer. I heard someone say this. I think you said this. I forget when we were talking, but when it comes to abortion, no one wins.
Yeah, that's right.
So it doesn't matter. Like, it's not like, well, this side, when it comes to abortion, it seems like no one wins. There's,
there are no winners.
There's
really
a lot of people who deal with a lot of difficult situations and pain. So to kind of address where you started, which is in the case of rape, or a woman is sexually assaulted, violated, it was, something was taken from her and given to her in that same sense. I think it's a really delicate one. First of all, as a man, I'm very sensitive in how I'd want to approach this, just personally, because I'm not in that position. I wouldn't be in the position to, be left with not only the trauma of being assaulted, but then the difficulty of now finding out that you're pregnant from an assailant, from someone, maybe someone you don't know, and what that's like. And there's been some cases. There's probably no more complicated case than the one that was in Ohio this last year of a 10-year-old girl.
Is that the Dobbs?
Is
that the Dobbs?
I don't remember the name. I don't remember the name.
It's the
But it was
Dobbs.
a 10-year-old girl that was, I believe, raped.
It's interesting. We actually had someone email in last minute this morning. Someone that literally said a long email and said, "I have been adamantly pro-life my entire life until that case."
Yeah, and so that's a lot of the sentiment. We have a lot of people who are conflicted.
Yes.
And so I wish there was a real clean and simple answer when it comes to this, and there really isn't. And I think that is another level of nuance to it, having a girl who's 10 years old. And I think there were people that asked questions about that, like is she even physically and mentally kind of able, or what I mean, a state of a mind, and what's that going to do to her? So I just think we have to. This is one where we have to allow a little bit of space for us to talk about it, and again, I have to know that I may have an opinion, but I'm not going to ever be in that position. And so it's easy for me to say it. Now, there is a side that's really hard. I was listening to someone else talk about it, and this is the side that I could speak from a little bit is, imagine her parents. I'm talking about this one girl, the dad, and having it's like it's so different when you're in the place. And so I think that's a really difficult one. The scriptural perspective that I would give, and this is where we haven't even gotten to politically and should the government allow, and for certain cases. So that's a whole separate conversation. You're just talking about this. The one perspective I'll bring, because I feel like it's just really awful to look at any woman who's already had that choice taken away and say, now you have no choice here. So I'm just going to say, again, but I also have a pro-life view and perspective. And so my pro-life view and perspective in this, as hard as it would be to even say and to anybody that's been in that situation. And again, I won't force my view on someone. I would, understand if they would make a different decision. But would be the one thing I have seen is that all throughout Scripture, the picture we get over and over is that God continually redeems what we mess up, and our broken, sinful, awful world. And I think that as difficult as it is, and some people have alluded to the fact that for a woman who gets pregnant from a rape to carry that baby is going to exasperate the trauma. Yes, most likely I've heard other women in other situations said that they actually viewed it differently. And so I just want to say that. I also mentioned this before. I think we should not downplay the trauma that a woman feels for choosing an abortion as well. Even in a case like that, either way, it's a loss that you're going to feel. And so I would say that when I look at Scripture, the picture I get is God can redeem what is messed up and broken and bring beauty out of ashes. And so I think the pro-life, I'm just going to say that the pro-life response would be that if a woman would choose to keep and carry that baby, whether to keep or give up for adoption, that God can really redeem something and do something beautiful with that child and that situation. And I was mentioning to you, this is what I was going to bring up. I was mentioning to you guys beforehand a movie that I watched last night. And you were wondering, how does that tie in at all? I watched the movie The Woman King. It was the first time I'd seen it. And powerful movie. And there is a scene that probably was the most impactful scene to me in the whole entire movie. And it's where the general, I forget her name, the one lady who's kind of the head of this women elite combat group for this kingdom over in Africa. She finds out that this girl who has been brought to the palace to train and become one of these soldiers, she recognizes from an identifying mark that finds out that this was actually her daughter that she gave up. She did not want, but because she was raped by these men from another tribe for days. And so she recounts and talks about her story of being raped over and over and over again. I can't speak to the validity or how much truth there is in this movie. I'm just saying this moment in the movie has caught my attention, maybe because we're having this conversation. And so she realizes that this girl she's now seeing was her daughter that she gave up, that she hid because of shame and the culture and everything, and she delivered. No one knew it. Had her friend give her up for adoption, and she ends up back and meeting her and realizing it's her daughter. And there's a really powerful moment where they're together, and she had already told her that she was her daughter and that she gave her up because she was raped. And the daughter said to her mom, she said, I'm sorry that, she basically said, I'm sorry that I'm the cause of a lot of your pain. Like, here was the daughter kind of saying, like, realizing, I'm sorry, after she found out. And the mom's response was like, no, you are not. It was joy on her face. And so it was this kind of like really beautiful scene of something that's really tragic that kind of painted this picture of seeing something beautiful come out of something that was really awful and tragic. And so I think the simple but still very complicated pro-life answer would be that it's possible that God will redeem and do something with that if a woman chooses to carry it. I think it's still a really, really hard decision. And I'm
not trying to put you on the spot, but to kind of push in to specify, I know you're saying God can do that, but I imagine the people listening, are you saying that the clear, with all of the other nuance considered, the clear pro-life response is that's what should happen?
I'm saying that a pro-life position based on Scripture would suggest that would happen, yes. That a young girl... Now, I have a lot of internal conflict in that. So it's like, that's where if you were to, for me to even sit down with a young girl who's been raped and doing that, and I guess that's the real challenge. If you were to have somebody sitting in front of you going, what should I do? You tell me. First of all, these are where I think in times, even like as my role in the church, I think at times that I feel like even pastors and other people, I want to say, maybe step beyond kind of what their role. I believe my role is to to try my best to reveal Scripture and to see and discover God's heart in every situation, and be able to just say, here's what Scripture says in this, but versus dogmatically saying you need to do that or you're sinning against God.
It is an interesting
and
thought.
so I don't. That's where I kind of hold a reserve in judgment and say, I would want to sit with somebody in that really difficult pain, figure out how it can come alongside them. But a pro-life response to it, again, not just politically, but I'm not scripturally, would be you don't take one evil and turn around and cause another one. That would be, I'm just saying scripturally, there you would not find a whole lot of backing for that. Yeah. That you take one tragic, sinful, evil thing that happened to someone and then turn around and do something else the Scripture would also consider evil or sinful.
Yeah.
So I think scripturally, I think that's what I see. Now, again, that's it's a hard one to walk out.
Yeah.
And, and I think there, I'm not, I guess what I'd say, I am not going to look with condemnation and judgment on someone who is going to decide to do that. I'm going to try to show as much love and support, but I also know that they're going to probably feel the after effects of maybe even making that decision afterwards. And I think that's where we need to be as a church. We need to come and rally alongside someone and not look at them in a judgmental light or not be in a condemning way if they choose to do something that's different because of their situation.
Yeah, I think that it has to be really almost a case by case, by person by person. The circumstances can be so different. You could have someone that, they were, violently raped and then they were pregnant, and so they're dealing with, anyways, lots of mental things and emotional things and maybe physical things too. They might be dealing with sexually transmitted disease on top of being pregnant.
Yeah.
There's all those things that kind of go into it. And I think it's, one thing to present, like what you were saying, that, God can take a tragedy and make something good out of it. But I also know that sometimes there may be a woman who the idea, of going into a pregnancy and carrying a child for 9 months would just, it might just take her over the edge. And you don't want that either.
Yep.
So it's almost, I think that instead it's like, okay, here's what's going on with this person, with this situation. And knowing that, that if they go ahead and they decide and say, you know what, no, I just, I can't do this. I just can't do this. That we are then ready to offer, to come alongside them.
Yeah.
And offer compassion and healing. I think that's the biggest thing, is just feeling compassion for each individual situation. That is to me is probably one of the hardest things to look at. And I like, what you were saying about it's been a tendency to do a big, broad, stroke and saying, oh, well, it's just this. And then, what happened as a woman, you end up feeling like, what about this woman who's gone through all this?
Yeah.
It's both. It's not just an unborn child. It's the woman too. And I know that we can get into, people get into all the thing of who has more rights and all that, and that's we kind of touched on that, but that's really not it. It's just that no matter which way it goes, there's going to be a lot of pain. Yeah. And either way, God can redeem that too. Yeah. But I think it's a very loving thing to present. This is, that kind of truth, and then it's also a very loving thing then to say, to walk with that woman, and stick with her and walk through whatever happens.
Yeah.
I also think too that a good point that is always important to remember: pro-life is not just about the baby; it's also about the mom.
That's right.
And so I think that's a delicate thing to walk through. And so I think to me the biggest thing is that the response of the church. You can have a pro-life position on this, even in these really challenging ways. You can have a pro-life position, but I think the way in which you approach them, the conversation, and how you really show love and compassion and mercy for someone who may make a decision that doesn't line up with a pro-life view. And what does it look like to come alongside and not condemn at that point, but understand, and bring love and grace. And that's, to me, the most important thing in that kind of situation.
Yeah, because many times, I mean, even for myself in my situation, was that I really felt like I don't have any other choice. This is I don't see any other way to to deal with this and to go forward except this. And for a woman that is dealing with the trauma of rape, and then in a way the trauma of like, oh my gosh, not only that, but now I'm carrying this child from this. This is not the way I thought my life was going to be, or whatever the situation in the specifics. It's like that's trauma too.
Yep.
And it has to be looked at and considered and looked at with compassion. And yes, God is pro-life is for the for the woman as well as for that unborn child, as well as it's just pro-life, all life.
It's complicated.
It is complicated.
It is very complicated.
It's complicated.
And you add the complication of a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
I think this is where, what's interesting, a lot of the questions that we've got. Now, I've read some articles recently. They've literally just been in the news feed. Oddly enough, and maybe they're always in there and just we're talking about it, so I just notice it. And one of the things that I see going again and again, and I think we even had some questions, like there is holding this moral viewpoint that maybe pro-life holds about life and the sanctity of life and how important and valuable it is. There is that. And there are people that have held that until they've been faced with a decision.
Sure.
It may not be in this, but in other ones. And the way they walked through it and decided and then ran into issues legally and other things that changed the way they view this politically. Yeah. And I think when we're talking about that 10-year-old girl, this is where I think I would feel so internally conflicted and challenged that as a father, because listen, I heard someone say, I was listening to another podcast and they were talking about it, and they were like, you got to imagine if she's 10 years old, this isn't probably necessarily even her decision as much as it might be hers and her parents' decision.
Right.
I mean, that's, and so, so when you flip that around and go, what if that was your daughter when she was 10?
Yeah.
I don't know what I would do.
Yeah.
Let me just say that. So I can have a great deal of empathy. Go, I don't know how I would feel, and I don't know what I would do.
Yeah.
I could see myself going, I want to help her, my daughter, the one I can see, the one I know. I want to rescue her from this pain.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah, it's really tough. I almost don't even want to add anything because I think, number one, it's so delicate, and I'm not a woman, and I literally cannot imagine the scar and the shame that would come from the first part of that.
Yeah.
Much less the decision. I am hearing in my mind as we're sitting here, just because I know people on all sides, devil's advocate, and actually primarily women that would devil's advocate the complexity. I have female friends that would actually say, it may be heartbreaking, but they would say to them morally it's still clear. And they would say,
it's clear in what way would they say? Like it's morally that it's wrong?
What the right thing would still be to do.
Okay.
I have female friends that are passionate about this. They're like, that they actually have stories that they know of people, women that have been raped or molested, and they will be the first to say, oh, this is heartbreaking. But don't add shame to shame, and it doesn't change the truth of. And so I'm not going to play that advocate. That's for those women to do. But I just say that because I know there's so many people that I would resonate with where you two land on the complexity of this, and it doesn't seem neat and clear to me. It does seem like whatever side you're on, like we talk about pro-life is not just the baby, it's the woman. It does feel to me that however people tend to approach this, especially if it's from an extreme, one side of life is minimized to the other.
Yeah. One decision or the other.
So if someone really resonates the most with the woman as the victim, it seems like all dialogue is lost for the child that didn't have a say in this,
Right.
and that didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, the person that's just adamantly, dogmatically, at times uncompassionately pro-life, the life of the woman is not considered,
Sure.
and her future is not thought about, and her soul and scars are not considered. It does feel to me, I don't know if that's fair, it does feel to me that on the extremes, usually one person in that scenario is not considered.
Yeah.
And so I like what you said about, our phrase from the beginning is truth and grace. And how do we live in that tension? And I love what Preston Sprinkle said. I think if it ever applies to any situation, applies to this, people will never hear your truth until they feel your grace. I think when you look at these kind of situations, I would just add an exclamation point to what you said about when you look at the examples of Scripture. Not only that God redeems, but the interesting thing about Scripture is God seems to redeem the most evil things. To me, one of the most evil things that could happen on this side of heaven is for someone to take advantage of someone else sexually, to violate. To me, it's just that is a clear case that I would say it's not just wrong, it's evil. That's evil.
Yeah.
And then I look at Joseph's brothers betraying him, selling him into slavery, destroying his future. It's evil. I look at, there's never been a more evil act in the history of humanity than to take Jesus, the Holy Son of God, and to torture him to death.
Yeah.
And I look at the most evil things that have ever been done and just look that God seems to actually bring the greatest beauty out of the worst ashes. And so, like you said, the hope is to hold that hope in front of people that are wrestling, while at the same time, I like what you said, give space. We just got done reading Eugene Peterson, Burning in My Bones, and I think you're reading it. And I love that it's a very counterintuitive kind of way he looks at his pastoring, that he'll hold out truth and he'll say, here's what I think Scripture's saying. But more than anything, the way he pastors, he held space for people. He held space for people to wrestle and process and sift through things. And so I don't know that there's a clean answer.
No. It's all ugly.
It's all ugly.
There's nothing clean. It's complicated.
It's complicated.
I mean, there's a reason why we say that, because,
and
that's why I would try to point out that some of these topics, I think Scripture is pretty clear. From a high level.
Yeah.
It's when you get down and you have it's not a policy and it's not a position, but you have a face in front of you.
Yeah.
Right.
You have a story.
Yeah.
That's when I think people get really conflicted.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we listen. I think, President Sprinkle also said the most loving thing you can do is listen.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes, and I want to just say this, both sides on extremes, there's not a lot of listening.
Yeah.
There's a lot of just like, well, I'm marching under this banner and this is kind of what my Bible says and this is what my belief is and this is, and there's not a lot of listening to each other and to other people. And I think when you listen to people's stories, that's when you kind of start to go, oh, I don't know what I would do if I were in your shoes.
Yeah.
Even though I've got these morals and these beliefs that I believe with everything, I don't. That's why I think there are as many women as there are who go to church, or in that one study that I said, believe that it was morally wrong at the time of actually having an abortion, is because the tension, the reality of that lived out. Some of them feel like I don't have a choice. As you said that, like some people emotionally, some people psychologically feel like they will not survive, or they, and so to me, that's where we just have to come alongside with all the grace in the world, not condemnation, and go, well, you did this, and the Bible says this, and so you're like, people feel enough of that weight. I think like my job is to come alongside and try to help lift weights, not put them on people.
Right.
It doesn't mean I don't show the truth, but I think there's a way to do it that's helpful and loving.
I think that if someone, for example, is coming to you and asking, okay, this is the situation, this is what it is, they're looking to you to say, show us, like you said, what is the truth of Scripture? What is it? Put that there, because they're wanting that peace in their, so they have it in making their decision. And not just maybe just looking at what culture says or what they've thought before this or whatever, and so that, and also too, then that so that they can ask the question, well, okay, that's what it says, but I whatever the thing is going on, I just don't think I can do this. I just don't think I can carry this child. I really don't. Then for us to be able to say, we're not going to turn our backs on you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And because and I think that's the one thing that we've all kind of landed on, is that it is different when you have somebody sitting in front of you.
Yeah.
And you're looking in them in the face, and they have tears coming down, and they're telling their story, and it's incredibly painful. And, it's almost, I have to just say, okay, Jesus would not condemn you.
Yeah.
Jesus is going to wants to heal you.
Yeah.
And then, and just going from there. But I think being able to put the truth out with compassion and with love,
Yeah.
and understanding and empathy to try to put yourself in their shoes and that kind of thing is probably the most important thing.
Yeah.
It's good.
It's good. All right.
Was there other parts of that we didn't?
Yes. So I read that in that email, I think are the three big things.
Okay.
Yeah.
This second one, and you two may disagree with me, to me is even more complex. It may not be a scarring on the front end, but to me, this question is even more complex. And that's, what do you do with this idea of assuming abortion is wrong when the life of the mother is at risk?
Yeah. This is one where I have kind of my view on this, and it's probably different than even what I would say. It's not different than what I believe, but it's where I would extend the most grace, because I think either way you're going to have a loss in this case. And again, you can look at it, I think, from a really dogmatic perspective, which is, you should never try to interrupt or mess with the creation of that, that baby, that, there's the arguments of sacrifice. There's all these things, right? And those are all certainly part of it. And it's very, very complicated. This is the one actual caveat that a lot of states have in their law to allow. The only caveat that most of the states now that the federal court has kind of overturned what gave that kind of blanket right nationally down to the states. And I was telling you this earlier, I've read a couple articles and heard some stories. Lorelei, my wife, told me about one she just read recently of a couple in Columbus right here that go to a church that we know in Columbus, in the area, got pregnant, and then ended up finding out, I think it was around 17 weeks, that their baby had a very severe, I don't know what you'd call it, syndrome, a severe issue where I told you I couldn't remember the name of it. It wasn't just organs developing outside of the abdomen. It was more extreme than that, because there are some babies that live with that. They do a cesarean, they can do surgeries and put the organs inside. That it was more extreme than that. It was like doctors were telling her like 0% viability, and that as the child continues to grow, though, it would cause danger to the mother and her life. And so they were, again, these are followers of Jesus who said, we have always been pro-life, have always voted based on that. And then here they are at the hospital where they're saying 0 chance for this baby to survive and live, and your life will be considerably in danger as it goes along. And all of the doctors or that hospital, I don't know which hospital, but you told me one that you think it might have been, their ethics committees and stuff like that, basically all said that even according to the state law, they could not have an abortion here because the mother's life wasn't currently in danger. In other words, it might be, but wasn't currently in danger.
Right, at that moment.
And so they talked about having to make these really hard decisions of, do we find a local place or a place, I don't even know how this all worked, because the hospital wouldn't, but maybe there was some question into the way it was written in the, in the laws, because some of these laws are they're very confusing the way they're written, and they're not clear. So, and there are a lot of doctors and physicians that are afraid to make that call, that they're going to end up being prosecuted, even if it's questionable. And so there's a lot of gray area in these. And so they had to make a decision: do you privately do something at a clinic that was going to cost maybe tens of thousands of dollars, or do you go out of state to get an abortion, terminate the pregnancy? they opted to go out of state to terminate the pregnancy, and it ended up taking weeks, like 4-5 weeks, to be able to do that. And so, what was interesting in this article was just hearing how they still believe morally they wanted this child. They did not want this to happen, okay, but it did. It was a reality, and how this has caused them to completely switch politically how they feel. Now, because of the impact. And so I've read actually a few articles. There's another one in Florida that I just read yesterday of a family that's similar situation, that the Florida law did not enable them to do it. So she actually is going to have to carry this baby that is not going to develop and most likely will die within minutes after it's born, and they can't induce labor until at least 37 weeks, even though they wanted to do that sooner. That state law wouldn't allow them. And so we run into a whole lot of legal ramifications on this. My personal feeling is that this is that area where I would extend complete grace to the mother, and I would say if they're married, to the father, even if they're not, mother and father, if they're in the picture doing it, I would extend complete grace in this kind of situation. And I would, because I think this is one of those, again, this is one of those unique situations where one of the lives is at stake. I would extend grace and tell that person, I encourage you to seek medical advice. And if you're a follower of Jesus, that you need to just seek God and allow the Holy Spirit to lead you. And however, this is one thing where I go, however you made that decision, I'm going to stand in your corner.
Yeah.
No judgment, no whatever. This is one of those areas where me personally, I think is so complicated and hard. It's not clear cut. It's not just like, well, and I understand there's a whole constituent of people out there that, and I think that's also, it could be a beautiful thing. And we see scripturally, we see sacrifices modeled over and over. What does it look like? And I think that there are some, and I know there's stories of women who do risk because they care if the baby, and that, again, situations where a baby can be viable and all that, where they do take that risk. And the good news is medically, this is very, very small. It's a big an argument.
Right.
But medically speaking, this is actually a very, very small likelihood that you can't save the mother's life when the baby is viable.
It's actually less than 1%. Yeah.
Way less than 1%. Like it's almost, it's different though. You get into ectopic pregnancies. You get into ones where the mom's life is at risk and the baby is not. It's not a viable pregnancy. To me, that you're not going to get any judgment out of me.
We're taking some extra time on these first two because they're very delicate.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to cover, so we need to keep going. Janice, quickly, do you have anything you want to add?
I think in those kinds of situations, for especially if they're saying like the one you were citing, where the mom's life will be in danger, the baby is not going to survive. To me, just to be in the position of like, well, we're sorry, you're both just going to have to not make it, possibly, does not, I don't see how anybody can just say, oh, well, that's what you should be doing, and the same thing is with ectopic pregnancies. I know of things that I've heard and read of just, well, yes, it's ectopic, but we have to wait and wait and wait and wait. And it's like, so what do? You wait until the fallopian tube ruptures and she starts bleeding internally, and then it's okay? I mean, those are the kinds of things that I have to admit make me kind of crazy, because it's like there's a reason we know how these things work, that God gave medical doctors to know how this works. So why don't we just go with that?
Where you don't want the laws to get in the way
you don't
of
want the
making
laws,
sound medical decisions.
And like you said, many physicians right now, it's very chilling to say, because it's every state is different. The laws are not really clear many times. It's like, do I stick my neck out and do this and possibly get prosecuted or lose my license? So yes, it makes it very.
And a lot of this, I don't know if you alluded to this, but a lot of this is, Janice, you have a background medically.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. And so she's
seen a neurosurgeon for years.
You're a spinal surgeon.
Okay.
Jack Shepard lost.
Yeah.
All right. Last part of last layer of that email is they asked about, okay, what about homelessness? So I think we could lump in
economic.
I think we could lump in here homelessness, economic issues, let me even say quality of life issues for the mother and the baby. Sure. I even think you could, I mean, it's a lot, but I even think you could put in here, what about disability? What if the child is going to have deep developmental disabilities? So economic issues, quality of life for both the mother and the child. How do you think through that, process through that?
I would probably, to me, holding a pro-life view, and I'll just again go back to a scriptural pro-life view, I would say that we as a culture, society, and I know that our culture is not necessarily pro-life in it, how we deal with these things, but what we're talking about is we're talking about somebody in poverty, and then we're also talking about a life. And so, I know that the pro-life position argument typically is, why don't we try to address the poverty instead of just legalizing or allowing someone to choose a way out of having the baby? Easier said than done. I think we've been talking about that forever, and we still haven't addressed it.
I personally don't even think that's the pro-life argument.
Oh, it is.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard it's absolutely the pro-life argument.
My point is, you rarely hear holistic arguments in the
Sure.
with the dogmatic legal pro-life
Sure.
arguments. You rarely hear holistic arguments.
And it's holistic would be, how do we address the life of the mom in that situation, and how do we help? I think that one, to me, I don't know that it changes a whole lot of things politically or in regards to being pro-life or pro-choice for me in those situations. I look at it like these are those kind of moments where if it's economic hardship, okay, I think these are actually quite different between that and maybe disabilities, but in economic hardship, this is where I would hope that our society and culture and the church provides opportunities for those women who want to keep the baby. That's the thing. If it's like, or if they want to give the baby up for adoption, but will help take care of her all the way through that pregnancy. And so I think the problem is a lot of those women that are in economic hardship don't feel like they have any support. They don't have, whether they're part of a church or a lot of single mothers who get pregnant won't say anything to anybody in the church because they feel so judged. And that's also something that I address. I said, I think the way the church has handled this has actually caused more women to run to an abortion that maybe didn't even want an abortion, but because of the condemnation they would feel in a community of being pregnant out of wedlock and young. And so to me, I think that's been, the church has been, hasn't handled and hasn't talked about these things very well. And so I think that, it's hard. I don't know that I would just see circumstantial and go, well, financially it's going to be a challenge, so go ahead and terminate the pregnancy. Again, I'm not going to ever suggest that, and I'm not the one in that place. I understand that. I do think this is where we as a church have tried with, whether it's through pregnancy distress centers and other things, to help fund them financially. I think this is where you really would hope to see society as a whole. And I think that's been one of the big challenges. Let's just not talk about those who are really impoverished, but I think one of the things that women, and this is the more holistic that we need to continue to address, is that a lot of women who find themselves in school or in a career path who get pregnant all of a sudden realize that I am going to be set so far behind that my male counterparts in school, when I have to be out for so long and I have to deal with kind of a child and all of the things that go with that, the responsibilities, is going to set me so far. And I'm already trying to just keep up with maybe men who are statistically paid more. You know what I mean? So I feel like there are a lot of holistic things that need to be addressed. One is in reproductive rights, how are we as a society really supporting women very well?
Right.
And the family, so that you're not at a massive disadvantage if you're a woman to your career or to an income, or because you might be trying to, maybe you come from really difficult economic hardship and you're trying to work your way out of that, and then to turn around and go, well, we don't care about that. You just need to, this is where I think the holistic needs to come. And I think there's a lot to it. As we know, I think I don't want to add any complication, but poverty is a whole other complicated subject that we haven't been able to address.
Well, and
sadly,
I have family members that are very passionate Planned Parenthood, very pro-choice. And I told you, I have a family member that listened to a couple of our podcasts on pro-life, pro-choice, And she said the one thing we had missing the most that she thinks is the biggest factor is education. She said when it comes to sex education and preventative.
No, actually, I did mention that. I believe on that episode I mentioned because where I actually was not aware that that was such an issue was sitting on an airplane talking to a guy for 2 hours, and that was his biggest thing was, and he was a black guy who came from a very impoverished neighborhood at one point, and here he was telling me, he said, but you don't understand, he said, a lot of these women, they're not taught about contraceptives, number one. They don't really, it's like you would think, sometimes you think, I mean, this seems like a simple preventative thing that you could do, and it's not. It's not talked about. In some cultures, it's frowned upon.
Right.
It's intentionally not. And so I do agree, though. I'm just saying, I think education is.
Yeah, you did mention that in the second one. I think maybe it was from the first one. It is a really, we're not going to skip ahead to political or get spicy, but it is a fascinating thing that abortions actually went down under President Obama, who was a very pro-choice president. And a lot of people said it was strictly because there was a surplus of education on contraceptives.
I don't know. I don't know if it would just be him though, because what last stat I saw on abortions is they've actually they've been dropping for over 20 years.
I saw it was over the last decade.
20 years? The one I saw was over the last 20 plus years. That's actually been steadily going down, which is probably a good thing. It probably is from a lot more prevention, would be my guess, than actual changing society and how they view abortions. My guess is it's been far more prevention. That's my guess.
Because I thought it went up under President Bush.
The one study that I saw just said it's been on a steady decline since Clinton, since Bill Clinton's era.
Well,
so I don't know for sure.
I'll have to fact check.
Somebody might, but that's I'd seen since actually Bill Clinton was in office that has been on a steady decline.
Anyways, sidebar.
And also, you also have to look at the thing that that there are more women who are single and unmarried that are just raising their children. They're carrying them and they're giving birth, and I think in our culture that's at one time that was like a very
scarlet letter
kind of thing that oh my gosh, but I think anymore it's more and more acceptable and just that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
You're going to raise this child without a dad, and or maybe you have a relationship with them or you don't. So I think that contributes some of it
that's an
too.
interesting point.
Yeah.
I do too. So.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Okay, I resonate with all that was just said. There's a question here that is interesting. I think I'm just going to directly respond to this through email, but it basically is talking about do ends justify the means, and goes through a lot of interesting things.
Was that the really long one?
Yes.
That ended up having some questions at the end?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways,
it was interesting.
It was interesting. Yeah, it was interesting. I think what I want to do is go to... I'll read the last two questions that she puts at the end of this, and maybe they'll segue into our next point.
Okay.
Number one, understanding that there are many belief systems in America, do you believe in a both-and approach to voting our morals, meaning do you believe it is all right to believe abortion is wrong, but also stand for women's rights, knowing that there are others who live by a different moral compass? Number two, whether or not abortion becomes the law of the land again, how can X-Church stand in the gap for those with unplanned, unsupported, or unwanted pregnancies? There's so much to unpack in both of those.
So the first one was basically...
Yeah, let me take the first one, because basically the first one is probably the next most asked question, which is what do you do with this whole thing politically?
Yeah.
Let's just be honest. If there's any topic that people tend to interweave their moral conviction with the political conviction, it's this. And so I won't go through all of them, but we had several questions that were like this. One of them said it this way: when it comes to voting morality, even though I believe abortion is morally wrong, I believe that religion and politics should be kept separate. We have plenty of historical precedent for what happens when religion controls the ideals of the nation. They are used to bend and twist people into submission. Another person said it this way: I hold very strong moral opinions on subjects like abortion. Personally, I feel it's wrong as a use of birth control and would love to believe in my marriage we would never make that choice. I know this is subject is touchy for many, but there are plenty of examples where morals and political opinions don't align fully. So here's the part. Here's the part where I think a lot of people have the biggest divide. Is it possible to separate your moral conviction from politically how that should play out. And I think there are a lot of people that find it incomprehensible that could look different, really. That if you're pro-life morally, then that means you're pro-life politically. And so let's dive into that. What does that look like, assuming your stance is, along with the complexities of rape and the life of the mother in danger, assuming that in general you feel abortion is wrong, what does that look like when you step back from a 30,000-foot view in our society and look at the laws of the land?
I think it's challenging in a couple regards. One, we're not a democracy; we're a democratic republic. So I think it does make a difference because maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. I mean, if we got to vote on all of these major issues, I wonder how people would land. My point being is that we really have a two-party system, and it very much feels like the liberal or Democrat position is traditionally pro-choice, and the Republican or conservative side is typically pro-life. And so, I think, like you said, I think the big issue that we have is that we conflate sometimes our personal morality with a political party even.
Right.
Which to me, I mean, we've mentioned this before, and I think John Mark Comer in his book, Live No Lies, even says, if you look at the 5 most significant cultural issues right now, like 3 of them fall on one and 2 of them fall on the other. And so if you're going to I'm going to hold to my morals, you're going to be really conflicted when it comes time to vote. And so what I think people end up doing is I think people end up choosing the issue that is the most important to them. Yeah. Right? And that's what we're saying. A lot of people in the church have, for a long time, have said abortion is the most important issue.
Right.
And reproductive rights. And here's the challenging part about this, I would just say, even politically. Some of those stories that I just shared, you can end up having these laws that are in place and maybe put in place based on certain perspectives or certain groups that are in power that are making these laws that actually get in the way of a decision that you want to make, even if you are pro-life. Those situations with the non-viable pregnancies, the mother's life is going to be in danger. That all of a sudden now it's like people, and that's what I was telling you. There's a story of that local family that was like, we have always been pro-life. They said always Republican in voting that way, and now we've switched. Because, and so I think for me, where I look at this, and again, I don't even know if this is a good answer, but I think, and this goes back to even our last conversation that we had about politics, at some point we do come to this intersection of my American citizenship versus my heavenly citizenship, and how does that play out? And I think that's the tension that we're seeing right here. I have my moral convictions, but I also do not necessarily feel like it's my place to push my moral convictions on society. I think the way I see it is I would want, people that would maybe share my same moral conviction that I would have that's given to me by Scripture, to operate in those arenas. So run for office and represent if you want to do that. And I may align with that politically if that's what I feel like is the most important thing. But I don't necessarily feel like, I mean, what I'm saying is I can respect that the government would give women the right to be able to make this decision on their own, even if I feel like it's morally wrong.
Now, here's the thing. So 2 things. Yeah. And then I want to hear what Janice has to say about this. Number one, we've gotten flack for that.
Oh, I know.
What you just said.
I know we have.
And even for less than what you just said in past podcasts.
Should we back that up then and just edit that out?
I almost wonder if we should. And though I agree with you to an extent, let me play devil's advocate. Because I think both sides I think there's extremes on both sides. I always say this. There's ditches on both roads. Yeah. And there are people who are like, no, this is a Christian nation. We should. And I'm like, well, no, it's not a Christian nation, number one. It does come from Judeo-Christian principles. And number 2, it has never gone well when a country has tried to impose religion on a group of people. That doesn't end well, and it's actually really bad for the truth that you're wanting to spread. Yeah. It actually kills it.
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't think anyone, if they actually took this to its logical conclusion, would want it all to be implemented. Yeah. I don't think we want a world in which you're locked up for lying. I don't think. I mean, maybe you'd want a world in which you're locked up for adultery, but there are plenty of morals that we don't currently have as laws. On the flip side, though, I'm just going to play devil's advocate. When people say, well, we shouldn't impose our morals. Well, heads up, we already do. Mm-hmm. It's already illegal to murder. It's already illegal to steal. Mm-hmm. So we do, and a lot of it is from a even though we're not a Christian nation, a lot of it is from a Judeo-Christian. I told you before, I think long-term our society has some decisions to make. Mm-hmm. Right now, it is not from an evolutionary standpoint that it's wrong to murder another human being. Mm-hmm. The reason we think it's wrong to murder another human being is because of Imago Dei. They're made in the image of God. The whole civil rights movement of why you can't enslave another person, Martin Luther King Jr. Was quoting the Constitution, where we're told that there's a creator who gave people inalienable rights and that they have equality before God. So there is a sense in which we have a basis for morality in which we make laws. Sure. And usually the dividing line in which something is made a law is when it affects somebody else. Mm-hmm. So the person maybe will play devil's advocate with you and say, well, if murder is illegal, and that's a moral, that's an imposed moral,
right?
Then if we think this language is a little harsh, but if that is a life in the womb, and if that life is being killed, then why would that not also be brought into the law?
Sure. I understand that logic. I mean, it's the same.
I'm just playing devil's advocate.
No, it's the same one that I mentioned that I heard with the pro-life argument, which is, the whole idea of I don't want to impose my morals on society. That I told you, with somebody might go, well, that's like saying I think it's wrong to have a slave, but I'm okay if you have a slave. Mm-hmm. Again, it's not really apples and oranges or apples and apples, but it's a little bit different, and I understand that there are a base set of agreed upon morals that do govern a civil society. Mm-hmm. We might feel like they come from Scripture, and I would argue that a lot of them did, and especially with our forefathers in the way they framed the Constitution. But there are also very well-intended atheists that would maybe disagree with your point about murder and say that, well, no, they might not have a problem with taking out the ones that are the weakest, but you know what I mean? So I'm just saying that
But I think it's a slippery slope danger we have in the future.
Sure, we get rid of all morals and we have no one, and that's why I think.
And I don't think we get our laws from Scripture, but there's a framework overall that was an assumed worldview from which our morality came that turned into law in America.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think that's still going to persist as long as there are people who have morals and values. Mm-hmm. I don't know why that would necessarily change. Now, what becomes majority, and we see that and have seen that for the last 30, 40 years, is changing our laws.
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot of laws that are changing around sexuality, around gender, around those things, because the overall agreed upon, I would say not even agreed upon, but the overall majority or consensus of those who get into office, but whatever power, are making those decisions for society. And so I understand those arguments. What I'm saying is that I'm trying to the best of my ability, and say, I want those morals. I mean, I said I am pro-life. So let me just reiterate that, just so because you said we receive a lot of flack. I am that.
You're pro-life morally.
I am pro-life. Well, no, I'm pro-life morally and politically.
Oh, okay.
I mean, to me, but that's where we talked about. There's all these caveats. What would I do? And I can have my own personal decision pro-life. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I line with Republicans. Mm-hmm. I think that's why I said when it comes down to voting, it's going to come down to which one do you think matters the most? Which one are you going to, because I guarantee you have to make some serious concessions when you vote along any party.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to go, well, I think that this person's, we say it all the time, the lesser of two evils. Yeah. I have to pick, if I'm going to have to pick someone, then I'm going to pick this person because I think that and more than likely because I think that they're going to make decisions that are going to benefit me. Mm-hmm. That's what we really tend to do when it comes to voting.
A lot of people say there's nothing more important than children. So if you're going to vote, you got to vote for...
See, but, okay. All right. Shh. I think this is the thing, is that so for so many years, that the pro-life, the abortion issue has become the hill that Christians are going to die on, no matter what. And to the exclusion of looking at anything else that this candidate or this person that's running for office is saying. I have a real problem with that.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's really what God is asking, because, I mean, come on. There are people who are in politics and whatever, they're going to massage things in whatever direction because they want to get elected. And and it's like, okay, what do you mean by pro-life? You're saying you're pro-life. What does that mean? I want to know your whole thing. Is that are you just, riding on not, being against abortions, or what are you saying about supporting moms? What are you doing about families? What are you doing about education? What are you doing about providing for help for those that are born with some type of disability? What are you doing? What are you doing about life? But also, it's I think that you have, like you said, it's like sometimes it's the lesser of two evils. And that's but that is the way our world is right now, and it's uncomfortable, and it's you're just like, I don't agree with this about you, but like you said, pick one, or just not vote, which I've done in the past at other times
for the sake of your conscience.
Yes, it's like I don't like either here. I don't think either of these people are good for this particular position, but. I think that when it comes to the issue of abortion, I tend to lean towards the side of just saying I am pro-life because I can't see any other way to be. But way that I'm seeing it playing out right now makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It makes me very uncomfortable because there are all these situations, and I feel like, if anything, it's making it difficult to see people in those individual situations. And I don't, and Jesus always saw the individual.
Yeah. I think it's a great point because I think the challenge is to be pro-life morally or even politically in the really binary world that we're in means that you are against women somehow. And I'm not. Like, I'm 100% for women and their rights and equality. I believe that. And we operate that way, even in our church. I mean, we really believe that women are just as valuable, equally valuable as men. And, and so I think the challenge is, as we'd say, I would lean pro-life politically. But at the same time, I totally can understand a lot of these people that are saying, man, these laws are impacting these kind of decisions, that it's not just elective. Like, I guess what I'm saying is when it comes to the issue of abortion, the elective ability to choose an abortion for lack of a better word, convenience, or the inconvenience of it, bad timing, it is one that is harder for me to get behind. Let me just say that. But in the case of, and again, these are those ones where the mother's life's in danger, or the pregnancy isn't viable, and what's going to happen beyond that, to even allowing those decisions in the case of rape and having an underage, a minor who's walking through all those. These are the places where I guess politically I completely understand where our culture would come from and wanting those options. I can understand that and go, I can kind of agree where it's like allowing people, especially that don't share my faith, to have that ability to make those decisions.
And some of the fear, I think, that comes out for women is that, okay, so this law that's stood for all these years, this ruling that stood for all these years for abortion rights. Okay, this has been overturned. Now it's down to the state level, and they have to all figure it out. And we have this patchwork of what's going on, and nobody really knows exactly what's happening and how everything's going to be applied. Well, what's next?
Sure.
Are you going to say, does that mean then that some state can come along and say, oh, well, we aren't going to sell you contraception.
Yeah.
We're going to get rid of that. We're going to do other things. I know I'm going to date myself, but that's okay. But my first job that I had was working at JCPenney at the mall. Yeah. And I got paid minimum wage, and the guys who
You
were
want to
doing
say how much that was?
$2.20
Okay.
or something.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. It was not much, okay, but I got paid minimum wage, and the guys who were the same age I was, that was doing the same thing I was, they got 25 cents more an hour because they were a guy.
Yeah,
Okay, so
that's wrong.
so I remember all that stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things,
Yeah.
and so I can totally understand, when these things happen, women's reaction of just saying, well, what's next?
Yeah.
What else? We fought for this, and what's next?
Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, you have to admit that some of the things that we see going on politically, you're like, that might be possible that somebody could try to do that.
Yeah. I think there's so many directions we could go with this, but I think at the end of the day, there's got to be grace for how people feel that certain issues need to be approached.
Yeah.
You alluded to
Absolutely.
it, but and some people would disagree with you because some people think
Probably a lot of people would disagree with me.
Well, I even mean what you said earlier about, well, if you're a follower of Jesus, the issues are split 3 and 2. John Mark Homers. Because a lot of people be like, what are you talking about? But think about this. There are certain
Should I address and say which 5 of those are? And
no, there are
Okay.
certain biblical moral issues that I agree with you seem to be on the right, and some that seem to be on the left. One that, and people may disagree with this, seems to be more on the left is a concern for the poor. But here's the deal: you could easily, if you wanted to create a dogmatic case for it, say, well, then you better be for welfare, and you better be for this,
Right.
and because Jesus and scriptures talk about almost nothing more than they do about the way you treat the poor.
Yeah.
So, i.e.,
Yeah.
connect the dots. You better politically be for welfare, and if you're not, well, then you hate poor people.
right.
Yeah.
And I think it's that sounds too simplistic, but I think we do that across the board instead
Yeah.
of saying, okay, here's my moral conviction. Now let me stand back and look at a national level and a
Yep.
societal level at 365 million people who believe different things.
Right.
And I agree with you. You made a great point. I think I've made it in one of our previous podcasts of what does pro-life even mean. I at least try to be specific. Like I believe in a very high intrinsic value of life, from unborn to women to immigrants to I'm against the death penalty.
Yeah.
Like and that puts me all across the board.
Yep.
But for me, it sounds cliche, but from womb to tomb, like I try to be pro-life. I mean, I really, really do. Like, I just, from the beginning to the end, like, I hold a high value for life.
Yeah.
And that gets tricky when, you try to address it. And I don't know that we're giving a clean answer,
Well-
and I don't know that we need to. But let me just say this. I lean towards, we've said this before, too. It's interesting in our nation, on both the left and the right, we're a country of extremes.
Yeah.
We want complete unfettered access to any type of gun without any restrictions.
Yeah.
And contrary to what people say, we're one of the most extreme on wanting complete unfettered access to abortion with almost zero restrictions that help protect the life of the unborn.
Yeah.
Where we have extremes on both sides, and it's interesting, and we got to think about that. And so for me, this is where probably the pro-choice and the pro-life would hate me. For me, I do think there's got to be some protection for the unborn, and I'm not in view and in favor of just abortions on demand. At the same time, I can't imagine a country in which people believe so many different things. I can't imagine a country in which women that are suffering rape or endangerment to their lives
Right.
are legally forced to not have a choice.
Yeah.
Where people are getting back street, back alley abortions, where 18-year-old girls are being locked up and put in prison. Like there are so many levels in which we have to approach this intelligently and pragmatically. And
No, I agree with you. I think that was the point I was trying to make, that, I guess just to wrap this question up, I think to that person's question, and this is, again, this might be even shocking for this, but I do think that you can hold, and this is that tension, you can hold a view morally, but actually think different when it comes to policy. And I think that's a little bit of what you were even saying. It's like when it comes to reproductive rights, abortions, I'm with you. I don't want a free-for-all, wild, wild west, whatever is convenient. I think that's, but at the same time, there's a lot of those situations that we've talked about that I think we've seen that sometimes that the laws or very dogmatic views on it actually end up hurting and not helping people in our society that are trying, that actually care about. I mean, we're talking about even some of these stories. It's like they wanted these children. This was not something that they just flippantly decided to do,
Right.
or for
Right.
they wrestled over these. Like I just think that's the hard thing, is that we just, you got to pick a camp and jump in it, and everything's just so extreme, and we're not actually
Right.
talking about
Right.
addressing the problems. That's the sad reality. It's just law for this, and this, instead of actually addressing it.
Well, one of the things, I'd be curious your thoughts, Janice, because this is be a whole nother podcast about women's rights and the whole, because that's a whole nother thing,
Yeah.
and you've alluded to it. An interesting conversation I had with somebody after a small group the other week was, this is just a question I've been personally, these are the weird things that Russ thinks about. How many people in a particular group or demographic have to agree something is oppression before it's oppression? Here's what and here's what I mean by this. There's a lot of language that to have any kind of restrictions against abortion is oppression for women, and going back to the Dark Ages. Well, first off, that's not true.
We don't have to go to the Dark Ages.
Well, not just that, but if you look at the laws of even some of the most progressive countries in Europe, we still were far more extreme in how far you could take an abortion to term. And so that's a whole nother kind of interesting narrative that's been kind of colored. But that aside, here's what I mean. If you were to go back and survey every slave during the time of slavery, I'm pretty sure every single one of them would agree this is oppression.
Yeah.
That's not agreed upon with women in America.
Right.
What's interesting is the most
With abortion.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Some of the most pro-choice people I know are women, and some of the most pro-life people I know are women.
Yeah.
Right.
And you take any group of women, especially if you're in church, put them side by side. I don't know what the statistics would be, but you'd have half saying this is oppression. Then you'd have half saying, no, I'm fighting for the little women have a right to live. I'm actually think this is the most important thing you can do I just think it's a very interesting, I don't even know where to go with that. I just think it's an interesting thought experiment of how many of a group of people have to agree on what oppression is when you take any number of women and they have a completely different view when it comes to this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know whether there has to necessarily be like agreement. I think oppression can be very personal. And that one person may say, this is, for example, that is pro-choice. Okay, I do feel like this is oppressive because it's taking away a freedom that I think I should have.
Yeah.
And the same thing, then with someone who is, on the pro-life politically kind of saying it, of like, okay, if we go back to, Roe v. Wade and the way it was, then, I feel like that is oppressive towards, this unborn child, whether it be male or female, all of those things. So I think it almost is it is a personal thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that there are women who would just say, personally for me, this is where I stand, but I'm not going to impose that on you. So I don't feel oppressed. I don't want you to feel oppressed, so that.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's a percentage or anything like that you could say, how many does it take? I think it's, we have lots of people who are very vocal about it and are going to say things. But that's part of, that's a part of a joy of being an American is that we can express those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good point.
Well, that thoughtless experiment segues us perfectly into the question on, relatedly, autonomy. One of the text questions says, what are things we can do as Christians when we encounter someone who wants an abortion? I think we've inadvertently tried to answer that and how we approach. But the second part of that is, what about body autonomy? That's a very open-ended question. But I'm assuming they mean in, legal ramifications. But how do you, any thoughts on, that's a big argument right now in pro-choice and pro-abortion movements is the bodily autonomy of a woman.
That's very interesting.
Well, I could just chime in. I think we've already kind of fleshed out all the nuance of it from a legal perspective. The one thing that I will say, and I've heard this argument before, I didn't think it up, but we have we believe in autonomy so many different ways in our culture and legally, except for when it is going to harm someone else. Again, if you have a culture that doesn't believe an unborn child is a person, well, then they're not protected by the Constitution. However, if you do, then that really does come into the question legally. In other words, I can do whatever I want with my body, but the moment I harm you, the moment I want to kill you, the moment I want to do something like that, that's when we have the laws that say, no, you can't do that. And what's fascinating is that the UN, here's a great example of some really massive inconsistencies culturally that we have in this regard. The UN has a document, a covenant that, so every nation that's a part of it, that talks about the death penalty and basically says that if you as a nation have a legal death penalty, you are two different women, one pregnant, one not, both found guilty according to the law, you are not allowed by law to put the pregnant woman to death. So it's amazing to me that at certain places, legally and politically, we hold this value. In one sense, we go, you can't put a pregnant woman to death, even though she may deserve it according to your laws of your land, because what are we saying? She might deserve it, but the innocent one inside of her does not. But I thought it wasn't a person, and it doesn't have rights. And again, this is higher than just the U.S. Constitution. We're talking about the UN has this. So we have what I'm just trying to point out is we have some massive inconsistencies when it comes to autonomy across the board in secular society that is just doesn't make sense to me. And I'm all for, I want the right to do whatever I want with my body. I think most people do. I don't want to infringe that on anybody else. But I would just say legally and politically, the moment that I think this conversation with autonomy crosses the threshold is when you are doing harm to someone else. And they don't have a choice in the matter, which people would say would be an abortion.
So I want to read something that popped up. One of the things I try to do is, if I get on the news each day, look at news on both sides. But one of my subscriptions, because I just think, whether I agree with them or not, is they're very well written, is the New York Times. And there's an op-ed I read when all this happened with Roe v. Wade. I was surprised it made it in the New York Times. It was by a woman. And I want to read it and get your thoughts, Janice, as a woman, on what she said. But it was interesting. She actually was arguing as to why she felt like the argument of bodily autonomy was unpersuasive and actually harmful in the abortion argument. And here's what and if you, I don't know if you have to have a subscription for this, but if you're listening, you want to read it. I just thought it was fascinating. It's by Tish Harrison Warren, again, a female author, op-ed for the New York Times. And she said 3 reasons that she really found the autonomy argument unpersuasive. Number 1, bodily autonomy. This is kind of what you're going at, is limited by our obligation to not harm others. You can't walk down the sidewalk naked. You can't go 75 miles per hour down, a school zone. Like there's countless examples of where, because really autonomy, the synonym is independence. It's this cry for absolute independence, which went to her second one, which is the term autonomy denies the deep interdependence and limitations of every human body. And she actually, I won't be able to do it justice, but she went into this deep, beautiful thing about how even for mothers and how they're dependent, for milk and then for nurture and for care, and then even when people are elderly, and just even all the different ways societally, like we can't, we're trying to break through lines that were meant to be there when we try to break out of every kind of interdependence, whether you want to say that from a spiritual way. The way we're designed and created is we're deeply interdependent on one another. And then her third argument, and actually it's a little bit lengthy, but I want to read a quote from her because I actually think this was just fascinating. Her third thing was, the pressing issue when it comes to abortion is whether championing bodily autonomy requires us to override or undo biological realities. And here's what she said. She said, in the Dobbs oral arguments, Julie Rickleman described what women experience if they lack access to abortion. Quote, allowing a state to take control of a woman's body and force her to undergo the physical demands, risks, and life-altering consequences of pregnancy is a fundamental deprivation of her liberty, end quote. Here's what Tish says. But is restricting abortion the same thing as forced gestation? Is it correct to compare abortion restrictions to a state, quote, taking control of a woman's body and a deprivation of liberty? And then she goes on and says, the state does not, here's what she says. All of us can agree that sex is the only human activity that has the power to create life, and that every potentially procreative sexual act therefore carries some level of risk that pregnancy could occur. Birth control significantly lessens the risk, but doesn't take it away completely. Yet the state does not impose this risk of producing human life. Biology does. Except in the horrible circumstances of rape or incest, which account for 1% of abortions, women and men both have bodily agency and choices about whether they will have sex, and therefore if they are willing to accept the risk of new life inherent in it. Our bodies undeniably, as women, place a disproportionate burden for reproduction. There is an inescapable asymmetry in male and female bodies when it comes to making and carrying life. To address the particular difficulty that pregnancy places on women, we need to, and she goes on, but just almost done. A sperm and an egg unite to grow into a human inside the body of a woman. The state doesn't force this to happen any more than it forces aging, or forces weight loss from exercise, or forces lungs to take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. To use language of forced gestation or of a state, quote unquote, controlling women's bodies is to portray biology itself as oppressive and halting the natural course of the body as the liberative role of the state. I just thought it was fascinating. I thought it was an interesting take on autonomy. I mean, a sub-conversation would be the power of language, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
Right.
Is it a fetus or a baby? Is it abortion or is it the reproductive rights of women? Is it, language itself on both sides really creates the narrative of what you're saying. But
it's fascinating.
Any thoughts?
Well, it was interesting. I thought, in listening to that, what she was saying, at least what I was getting was that really the right and the decision is, okay, am I having unprotected sex and this, I could get pregnant. And that's where it goes back to. It goes back to that, which is true. And so really where the decision is, it needs to be there, and if you look at it, the state is not forcing you to do that. You have to make that decision. I think where I hear women many times land is, again, you can't, it's my body, I will do what I want with it. Well, you did. And now you want this, layer here so that and unfortunately, many times it's just for the, if you want to call it a convenience or whatever, that to me is the saddest, I guess, indictment on womanhood, on being female, to be able to look at it that way, because that goes against everything that God created us to be. To be able to just feel that this is an inconvenience and be that hard and callous about it, I would challenge and say that probably somewhere along the way you're not going to feel that way in the future, but you might at this moment. I think, there's plenty of times the state has come in and said, for example, you choose to drink and you get drunk and you go drive and we catch you, you are going to, because you could hurt somebody and maybe you will. You can choose to do that, but we're going to tell you no because you could hurt somebody.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think, to use that as just saying, it's my body, it's my right. Yeah. I think that that's very dangerous. Because then it opens up all kinds of other doors too. Right. So that's it's very thought provoking what she wrote. Extremely.
Yeah. It's again, if you're interested, Tish Harrison Warren, I believe, op-ed New York Times.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, just to chime in, because I think she said it very well. I think anytime we are trying to do something that violates natural, I don't know the term I'm trying to think, it's natural biology, natural anything, I think we have to seriously ask the question, what are we doing? And I heard someone once say this in an argument, a pro-life, pro-choice argument, and they were talking specifically about rape. And they were just even saying that you have one violation that happens, and again, we discussed this, does it justify doing another thing to the baby? And the sad reality, they said, was that regardless of how it happened, biology worked.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's, you know what I mean? It's like her body worked the way it's supposed to work.
Right.
Even if it was a violation of her body. That's the really hard thing. So I've heard this conversation about understanding our biology and how our biology works and what we are talking about. It's totally different than, like you said, the language. That was really a manipulative way to kind of say the state control your gestation, almost like, so the state's coming and putting eggs that are fertilized inside of you so that you have to grow kids for that. That's not what we're talking about. And I think that's the argument she's making.
Yeah, the marketing on we got to be wary of brilliant marketing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Preston Sprinkle, even in Embody, talks about this whole thing. If we hijack biology and make it the scapegoat,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point.
Anyways, it's fascinating. And then I feel fearful to even say this as a male. But if I were to take the car and put it in reverse, I think if I'm a follower of Jesus, I think whether I'm male or female, one of the things that, in terms of autonomy and independence, I have to think through is everything we're told in the New Testament. Paul's saying, my body's actually not my own,
That's right.
but I'm bought with a price, and therefore I honor God with my body. And everybody has to flesh out what that looks like, male and female, and circumstances are complex. But okay, here's a question, interesting question. I couldn't stop thinking about today in church that maybe there are women here who don't have guilt or shame about their abortion. Maybe they're actually grateful that they could have a baby at a time when they could love and support their child. Maybe an abortion saved their life. Maybe an abortion freed them. Whatever it is, I wonder if they feel guilt for not feeling guilt. Is it possible to know abortion is morally wrong, but I still have one given circumstances? Should we let our belief on what is morally wrong as Christ followers dictate law? Anyways, it goes back into the laws.
Yeah.
But basically the whole thought of, it's an interesting thought, because, one of the things, since the message was delivered with such compassion on Sunday, is with the assumption that, for the most part, a lot of women, whether they believed it was wrong or right at the time, suffer with shame afterwards. What about the women that say, I actually don't feel guilt?
Well, I'm sure there are some that there are women that feel that way. It's like, this was the right decision for me. This was the right decision for my family, for my circumstances in life, and all of that. And I've talked to women that feel that way. I guess, in my mind, in my heart of hearts, is that I feel that at some point, even in their walk with Jesus, I really truly believe there will be a time when they're going to look at that and say, maybe, that's not the way, I guess I do feel something, But yes, there are women who will do that and may have more than one abortion because they just feel this is the way I choose. I have this right. I'm going to go ahead and do it, and I feel like it was the best choice, and I'm comfortable with it.
Yeah.
But I do believe at some point there's things, whether they express it or not, that those things will come up, and they're going to feel that.
Yeah, I think there's so many questions that I would want to ask from that, because I think it depends on the circumstance, depends on the person. I think there's probably a spectrum of that.
Yeah.
There's the person that maybe not even a believer, and we've seen the extreme of people that are almost bold about having abortions and almost brag about it. Women with 28 abortions and counting T-shirts. But then on the other side, I actually have someone in mind I know that's an incredible person. They're a follower of Jesus, and they had an abortion early in life, but they're still conflicted on, I feel like it was right at the time. They're actually an amazing person. It may seem unthinkable for people, but I agree with you. I think whatever the area is of our lives, if we're following Jesus long enough, just because I guess there's a spiritual pastoral side of me, I think Jesus loves us enough that whatever it is in our lives, he's going to eventually bring back to the surface as a good surgeon, as a good father, so that he can heal it. And I think it's hard for healing to flow before conviction and confession is there.
Yeah.
I think the two go hand in hand. And so, I don't know if you have any.
Well, I think it's, well said. I think guilt comes from having a moral or a conscience in that regard to begin with. We feel guilty about breaking law because we know the law exists. It's kind of like in Romans where it says that before the law, it's almost like people didn't sin because they didn't know it to be sin. And so, again, I don't know if this person was like just asking hypothetically. I don't know if they're asking for a friend. I don't know if they're asking for themselves, but I don't know. But first of all, I think it's really hard for any of us to determine how somebody feels about something. So I'm not going to just jump in and go, you should feel guilty. I'm not going to say that. That to me seems
that doesn't work.
That doesn't work.
No. You're telling me that guilt and manipulation are not effective.
Apparently they don't work. But the other hand, I think that if there is a moral side to this that I believe exists when it comes to life and spirituality with God, that if someone doesn't, because like you said, I've watched all kinds of clips and shows of people that I've seen them way more than 28 and they're celebrating it and going, I love it and I'll have as many as I can.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. But what I see is I don't see someone who has any type of conscience that's been formed by that moral.
Yeah.
I see someone who has whatever their worldview has been shaped by a different morality or a different level, so they don't see it as wrong. If you don't see something as wrong, you're not going to feel guilty for doing it.
Right.
I mean, that's reality. And so my response to that question in general, I don't know about anybody in particular, is that if somebody's not guilty for doing something that I personally think is wrong or sinful, again, this is my personal view in Scripture, my guess is that they probably don't share my same view of Scripture, and maybe they're not a follower of Jesus. Because they're just asking that generically.
Right.
If you're not a follower of Jesus, I can understand why some people, they don't have that moral and that value. What I would agree with you is if at some point they do, or if they are a follower of Jesus, at some point they actually do step into a relationship with him, what I think he will do at some point, and I agree, and I love the way you said it, as a good father and as a good surgeon, will take some of those things that have been buried. And because I do think that happens a lot where there are people, I know this, even in our church, that are brand new to faith that come and then they might step into a series like this and go, wait, it's wrong.
Yeah.
Any one of these topics.
Right.
Wait, the Bible says that that's a sin, but I do that, or I've done that, or I'm living this way.
Yeah.
And I think whenever that happens, that's when the tension comes, and maybe not guilt. What I hope people would experience is a conviction, not a condemnation from the church, and even from Christ. Because I think John 3:17. Everybody knows John 3:16, but John 3:17 is maybe even more powerful. I didn't come into the world to condemn the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I think that perspective is, I guess, what I would say. And I would never. I would never just go ahead and say, no, they should feel guilty. Like, I'm not going to do that.
That didn't work.
But I think the reason why somebody doesn't feel guilty is because they don't see it as morally wrong.
Right.
So I find they would be at odds with that.
Yeah.
That'd be my guess.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
Couple more questions, then we're going to land the plane with some hope. Here's one. Very interesting. What do you all think about things like CRISPR and gene editing?
Oh, jeez.
All right, Elon Musk, what are we going to do? Do you think it would be a good thing or a bad thing to be able to one day, quote unquote, edit genetic disorders out?
I will do this real quick
very
because
quick.
when none of us are like
that.
signed to, I don't know that I would have a problem with editing out genetic disorders. And I know some people are like, wait, you're messing with genes. Yeah, I know. We have found, so I read a book a while back by Francis Collins, who was really the head of the Human Genome Project. And he's a Christian. He's a Christian. He's a theistic evolutionist. So it's a little differences and maybe some views. But he even talked about like sickle cell disease and certain things they have pinpointed and found in the genetic code. I mean, you're talking about a needle in a haystack. They've found some needles in haystacks that said in this genetic code, we see in every single patient that has this what it is, and it could potentially be changed. Some people would just be 100% against messing with genes. My big theological view of this is that I think that when God created the code, the genetic code, everything was right. It was perfect in the process. Throughout history, whether we attach this to the fall, whether we attach whatever, you look at, there's all through Scripture, you can see incestual relationships. You see all these things that can cause. You see epigenetics. You cause things that can affect and change DNA. You see failures sometimes in the appropriate environment for the baby to form correctly. There's missing proteins, enzymes, things like that. We know these things cause genetic defects even now. I look at it from intent and design. I say God's intent and design in creating things, it was perfect and it was good. Everything he made was good. I think what has happened since then as a byproduct of the world that we live in that has actually broken down and messed up what God originally wrote. So it's almost like the code got changed. So again, this is a very ethical question. There's a lot of ethics involved in this. Is it okay for us to go modify the code back? Now, I think the slippery slope is where does that end?
Right.
So now we are just starting to mess with genes and going, oh, well, now you get eugenics. Now you get all this like, oh, we can just go ahead and change it because I think more people should just be brown hair. You know what I mean? Like, right. I just think that's the fear when it comes to ethical decisions like this. I'm not saying we should, but when I see people who suffer because of a genetic disorder, and I know people have kids that have, and I see how heartbreaking and difficult it is to go, if there is a clean, simple way to modify that in utero or early that, obviously that change that, I don't know that I'd be against it. I know that people probably like don't like that. That I would say that.
And there's a difference, too, on I just actually, not too long ago, read a bunch of stuff on this because that's what I do. I get interested
you like this
in something.
Stuff.
And there's a difference between using, CRISPR technology for someone who has the disease and you're basically just modifying them and those cells and using it to modify the cells that will be passed on genetically. And that's where some of the ethical stuff is. And also speaking to what you said of just saying, oh, well, then does that mean that, okay, we want, we're short, but we want this baby to be tall. Or we want...
I want a football player for a son. Right, I want a basketball player going to play in the NBA. Can you help me out?
But yeah, there are some very definite diseases that could be really, I mean, sickle cell is one, cystic fibrosis is another one. There's a number, there's some muscular dystrophy type things that could actually be, cured, and that would be amazing.
One last question. Some of the other ones, they really just go with the others we've already answered, but this one caught my heart because I think this is more of something someone personally, emotionally is feeling through. And they said, while not technically pertaining to abortion, still something that I feel like is a close conversation. My wife and I am currently working through the grief of a miscarriage. Pastor Tim hit on several verses discussing the subject of life and God's plan prior to birth. A common theme through some grief wrestling is if children are a gift from God, as seen in Psalm 127, and God had a plan from the beginning for this child, where does that leave us in the wrestling? I understand God didn't intend for miscarriage, and it's a factor of the fall, but still, questions around this, I guess, and where God's heart maybe is on this subject from y'all's perspective.
I actually had the conversation with that person because I asked them to write it in, and they were very broken.
Yeah.
And so we talked for a little bit, and again, sometimes just hearing the obvious is, I was like, we know there's a huge difference between a natural and an unnatural failed pregnancy. And they know that, there's almost just not much you can say. Like he said, like every night, my wife I'm having to reassure her. And I said, you need to make sure you reassure her it wasn't her fault. Because I think a lot of women this isn't personal, but just from a lot of women that I've talked to and I've pastored that have had miscarriages, one of the things a lot of them wrestle with is feeling like I do something wrong. That I didn't have the right. You know what I mean? It could be from anything, but what's wrong with me that I caused this? And he's like, I do, but it's like every night and trying to, and all I could say to him was, again, this kind of goes back to the same, I'm just going to land in the same place as my hopeful faith in the redemption of God is that this is not, and I'm the one who even told him that. It's like, I don't feel like this was ever God's intent and plan for us to experience death and loss, because I know because when he makes things new, that he's going to do away with death. And he's going to do away with crying and mourning and tears in that regard. And so I look at from the very beginning, before sin entered the world, before we have a broken, messed up world, before the genetics have been messed up, before all of those things, and say this was God's heart and intent. And I don't believe that God, because the question, I think that, I don't know if it came out in their ass, like, how do I understand if like children are a gift from God, but then this happens? How do I rationalize this? Or I'm supposed to trust in God, but like, almost like, is God behind this? Is God, you know what I mean? And I just said, I don't believe that this is ever God's heart and design. There's so much evil that happens in the world, some by choice, some not by choice, some as a byproduct of just being in this world that we're in, that that inflicts a lot of pain and heartache. And so I just said, I believe that child that you lost is with him today.
Yeah.
And I want to believe that personally. This is I don't know how people land theologically, but I want to believe the one redemptive storyline over the last 64 million babies that have been aborted in the last 60 years or whatever it's been since Roe v. Wade, and even before that as tragic as maybe all those deaths are, I believe that they're with him in eternity. And I said I would live with the hope that one day you will get to meet this child. And just because you didn't have the time or the ability to enjoy, appreciate, doesn't mean that God did not have purpose for them from the beginning. It's a factor of things that happened. And so very heartbreaking situation. I think there's a lot of women that have experienced this, and all I can do is try to offer some comfort and, encouragement, prayer, and insight for them. But
I think the first thing I would just say is how sorry I am.
Yeah.
That's what has happened. And also that I know that there's questions without answers on the side of eternity. Sometimes we don't know the answer. It's human nature to always ask why, to want an explanation, to put things in context, to make things make sense in some ways. But sometimes we can't. And at that point, what we do is then we just trust in the character of God, that He's good, and that He's going to meet us at that place in our brokenness and our grief and our hurt and the questions that we aren't really making sense out of, and knowing that He's going to meet us there, and that He's going to carry us through, and that He does take all those things and use them in some way. That this couple, will at some point down the line be able to reach out to someone else and sit with them, like it says in 2 Corinthians, and give them the comfort that they've been given, because He will meet them with that comfort. And they'll be able to do that. Not that makes it any easier or any less painful now.
Yeah. I, like you said, if you're watching online, we just want to say we're so sorry. And we extend just our hearts to you. And I'm not in those shoes, but personally, almost every close guy friend I've ever had, him and their spouse have walked through this, and so I've been able to hear firsthand from the closest people in my life the same questions, the same guilt, the same wrestling, and so you're not alone. Number one, in your pain. And there is kind of what you're alluding to. There is this mysterious, there's just so many mysterious overlaps this side of eternity. There's the overlap of Psalm 130, that God fearfully and wonderfully is the creator of life on one hand, and then the catastrophic momentum of the fall and the things that happen on this broken earth in the other hand. And anyone that claims to have that mystery of that, where that overlap is figured out, they just don't know. And I had a former mentor that he used to say, Russ, can you trust God with a mystery? And this is a painful mystery. But, oddly enough, I do think of what I think Paul was usually saying this of people that die in old age. But I for some reason, the verse comes from Paul. He says, we grieve, but not like those who have no hope. And I think especially when you're talking about the loss of a child, if there's ever a situation where you have hope of where they are, that you grieve, you process, you mourn, but there's absolute hope that there's a resurrection coming, and that there is a beautiful reunion ahead, and that there is, like you said, end of Revelation, tears wiped away, no more death, no more sorrow, and so our hearts go out. But Janice, we started this off talking about some of your story, but I was taken back in the best of ways by just the beauty, really, that was so striking of how you processed in some of your healing journey. And so would you mind just close us out by sharing some of that?
I guess the first thing is that I am so grateful for the love and forgiveness of Jesus, that He makes all things new, and I got to a place where I had to, I went to Jesus and just said, I forgive me. I know this is wrong, and not because I sat in a church that condemned me, but because I just knew it. And because up to that point, I just felt like this was unforgivable. This was just unforgivable. And, and once I received His forgiveness, then I could forgive myself. And then it was much easier then to sit in the church and hear all the rhetoric and all of the stuff and just say, you know what, but Jesus, you don't say that to me.
Yeah.
You don't say that to me. And knowing that child is with Him. I in my mind, it's like when I get to heaven and, and I see Jesus face to face, that, He's going to show me that child and say, here she is, and that He's, just hanging on to her. As I've gone through the, years, it's like, at first it was like, I can't talk about this. I know I'm forgiven. I forgive myself, but I just can't talk about this because it's risky, because you don't know if you're going to get judged. You don't know if somebody like, oh, I thought you were a good Christian, all of those things, and the fear of that. But, He kept putting me in positions with women and just saying, I can't just stay silent while they're suffering. I have to share with them what He did for me and how He set me free. And I shared this with Pastor Russ, but I finally figured out what the date was. But it was basically about 12 years after I had my abortion. And I had little kids at that time, really little. And one night I had a dream, and it was like a music video. And I saw myself sitting in like a rocking chair, and I was rocking, and I was singing this song, and I got up and I wrote it. And I wrote the song down, and the music and all that, and I wanted just to read the lyrics because it encapsulates what I feel my healing has been, but also what I know that He can do for any woman. And the song's called Lullaby, and yes, this is the original copy, guys.
Wow, come on. We can see that.
You can see it.
Hold it up for the camera.
Yeah, it's rather. There's probably coffee stains and tear stains and stuff like that.
So you're gonna read it or sing it?
I'm going to read it.
Okay,
I'm going to read it.
Sorry, you can read it.
I'm going to read it. Okay, so the scene is I'm sitting in my living room in the rocking chair that I had that I rocked all my kids in, and it's in the middle of the night. It's quiet, amazingly, with little guys, and all that. And this is what I'm singing. It says, it's quiet in the house as I sit rocking. Peaceful slumber fills every room. But my arms are empty where you should be, my little child, and my heart aches to hold you. My child, I've never seen you, but you're so real to me. Each year my heart marks the day you would have been born, and my heart marks with pain the day I chose to end your life. Some would call me a murderer. I was wrong. I know that now. But I have a loving Savior who has forgiven me and washed me clean. His love, so unmerited, comforts me when I still hurt. He loves me, and so I can say, Jesus, keep my child safe from me. Hold her close and sing her a lullaby. Tell her I love her, I miss her, long to hold her. I thank you that I know that she's with you. And Lord, I thank you that the day is coming when I'll see you face to face. With love and joy in your eyes, you'll say, here is your child. And then this empty place will be no more. Jesus, keep my child safe from me. Hold her close and sing her a lullaby. Tell her that I love her. I miss her, long to hold her. I thank you that I know. I thank you that I know that she is with you. With you.
Wow.
So, that's my story.
Wow. It's powerful.
Yeah,
I don't have any words.
I don't know how to. I don't know how to follow that.
I guess, you know, before this podcast, the thing I just prayed is I just really wanted to make sure that we gave hope.
Yeah.
To those that maybe have dealt with abortion, whether you're the woman or you're the man that was alongside, that there is hope and there's healing, and Jesus can just turn it into something that He will. You deepen your relationship with Him. I know I told you it's really hard to be super judgmental of other people when you realize how much He's forgiven you for.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, I think we end on that. Wherever you're tuning in from, whatever journey you're at in life, we just extend to you all the hope in the world, because we all need
Amen.
it. Starting here, I don't know anybody that needs more hope than me, and mercy and grace, and so we hope to be a home, even this podcast, a home of hope, even as we think critically.
Amen.
That no one is beyond the redemption of God. No one is beyond the grace of God. And so if you're, by the way, you know, if you're part of our church, you probably know this, but email us at the podcast at thex.church if you even want to know further steps. One of the great things I know, Janice, you're doing is adding licensures of grief counseling, and you're very involved in counseling and in grief, and so if you want next steps, or you just need to talk to somebody, email us, and we want to be here for you. And by the way, on anything that offended you or that you disagreed on, as always, thank you for showing grace, number one. Number two, let's continue the conversation. Email us, podcast@thex.church.
Yes.
We're going to have at least one follow-up podcast around this series at the very end, where we circle back on some of the catch-all, follow-up questions, follow-up disagreements.
Awesome.
And if nothing else, I will email correspond with you on our disagreements. Cool. And again, episode 84 and 87, go back to the podcast. And we didn't do it this week. I meant to make a note, but last week we had physical copies of books we recommended. I think we would say one book, if we could recommend any book, would be Nancy Percy's Love Thy Body.
Yeah.
Just a great, the whole thing's not about abortion, but a great book on just the body, creating a biblical framework, and parts of it are on abortion. So get a copy of that, read it, and until next time, thank you so much, Janice, for sharing your story, sharing your journey, and I believe this is going to be a provocative conversation, but also hopefully a healing conversation for many. Right. So it's been a long one. Thank you for everybody that has stuck with us, and until next time, we'll see you next week.